The examination room was quiet, sterile, filled with the soft hum of the air conditioning and the steady beeps of the heart monitor. For the nurse, a 40-year-old professional, this was another routine day. She moved with practiced efficiency, her hands busy with charts and medical equipment, her mind slightly detached as she cycled through her duties. Day after day, the sameness of her work had become a comfortable monotony, and she had learned to find solace in the predictable rhythm of it all. Yet today, something felt different. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, lingered in the air. It wasn't until she entered room 204 that she understood why. Her next patient was already seated, waiting. The man, in his early 40s, exuded a calmness that immediately stood out. His posture was relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his eyes quietly observing the room. There was a quiet strength in his demeanor, an air of composure that caught the nurse off guard. She had seen countless patients come through the doors, each one, despite their own personal anxieties, tended to be restless in their vulnerability. But this man was different. His gaze, though polite, carried a depth she couldn't quite place, and for a brief moment, the nurse found herself hesitating. Hello everyone. Welcome to the podcast, where we explore in a whole new way. Let's dive into the exciting world of podcasts, where each video offers knowledge and unforgettable experiences. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new information. Now, let's get started. Good morning, she said, her voice steady and professional, though there was a slight tremor underneath the words. Morning, he replied, his tone smooth, unhurried. His eyes met hers, and there was a subtle intensity there that made her shift slightly on her feet. She busied herself with his chart, scanning the details, using the moment to compose herself. She had been doing this job long enough to know the importance of maintaining her composure, especially in front of patients. You're here for a routine checkup? She asked, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the clipboard. That's right, he answered, his voice low and calm. Routine. The nurse nodded and went through the motions, starting with the basics: height, weight, blood pressure. As she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, her fingers brushed against his skin. The contact, though brief, sent a small current through her, unexpected and unsettling. She glanced up, but he was watching her with the same calm curiosity, as if waiting for something. There was a moment, a pause, where the room seemed to shift. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, and the nurse found herself acutely aware of her own heartbeat. She reminded herself to stay focused, to remain professional, but there was something about the way he looked at her, his gaze steady and unyielding, that made her falter. She moved on to the next part of the examination, but her hands were no longer as steady as they had been moments ago. The routine questions she asked felt hollow, the usual script of patient-doctor interactions suddenly inadequate. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move, and it was as if the space between them had shrunk, though they had barely moved. Her skin prickled with an awareness she hadn't felt in years. As she asked him to remove his shirt for the next part of the examination, she felt her pulse quicken. He complied without hesitation, the quiet rustle of fabric filling the room as he pulled the garment over his head. His bare chest was broad, muscular, and for a moment, the nurse's breath caught in her throat. She chided herself, inwardly scolding the unprofessional thoughts that crept into her mind. But as she pressed the stethoscope to his chest, the steady thump of his heartbeat in her ears, she couldn't ignore the way her hand lingered a little too long against his skin. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on hers, and in that moment, they both understood the unspoken tension that had been building since the moment she walked into the room. It was subtle, but undeniable, a pull that neither could explain nor ignore. Her hand trembled slightly as she finished the examination, but the atmosphere in the room had already changed. The boundary between patient and caregiver had thinned, blurred by something neither had anticipated. As the nurse proceeded with the standard preliminary examination, she found herself unable to shake the unsettling awareness of her patient. Normally, these routines were mechanical: check the blood pressure, take the pulse, and move on. But today, each step felt oddly weighted, her focus drifting to places it shouldn't. The patient sat calmly, offering no resistance, yet his quiet presence seemed to fill the room in a way that unsettled her. She applied the blood pressure cuff around his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin once more. That same electric sensation shot through her, but this time, it lingered. Her eyes flicked upward, expecting to meet his gaze briefly, as was customary. Instead, his eyes were already on her, watching intently, as though reading her thoughts. His gaze wasn't invasive, but it was steady, confident. The quiet intensity in his eyes made her pulse quicken, though she tried to maintain her professional demeanor. "Relax," she said, more to herself than to him. She adjusted the cuff, tightening it with more force than necessary, hoping the brief moment of discomfort would break the tension. He didn't flinch. The man simply continued to watch her with that same composed expression, as though he could sense her growing discomfort and was patiently waiting for her to acknowledge it. The silence between them stretched on, thick with an unspoken energy that made the small room feel stifling. She checked the reading, her fingers trembling slightly, and moved on to the pulse examination. His wrist was warm beneath her touch, the strong rhythm of his pulse beating steadily under her fingertips. She tried to focus on counting, but her mind wandered. Why did this simple encounter feel so different? His gaze remained fixed on her, and with each passing second, she became more aware of his presence, more aware of herself in ways that were unfamiliar. The tension was palpable now, but neither of them spoke about it. It lingered, a silent third presence in the room, daring one of them to break the quiet. "Your pulse is a bit elevated," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Is it?" he asked, his tone calm but with a hint of something more beneath the surface. "Maybe it's the company." Her breath hitched slightly, caught off guard by the subtle implication in his words. She glanced up quickly, meeting his gaze again, and there was no mistaking the mutual understanding that passed between them. His calm curiosity mirrored the growing intrigue she tried to suppress. The nurse had never allowed herself to cross such lines with a patient before, but something about this man felt different, dangerously different. As her fingers lingered on his wrist, longer than necessary, she felt his pulse quicken. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what she already knew: they weren't imagining the attraction. Her mouth went dry, her body betraying her mind's desperate attempt to stay composed. She could no longer ignore the undercurrent between them, the tension that had started as a mere whisper but now hummed loudly in the small room. She finished the pulse check, pulling her hand away as if burnt, but the touch had already left its mark. The moment between them was heavy, hanging in the air like a charged wire, dangerous but impossible to ignore. Their interaction was unlike any she had experienced before, and for the first time in years, she felt something awaken within her. It wasn't just his appearance or his demeanor, though both were undeniably attractive, but the way he seemed to see right through her. She was no longer the efficient, detached nurse in his eyes. He saw the woman beneath, the one who had grown numb from the monotony of her life and her work, the woman who longed for something more, something real. His quiet intensity mirrored her growing desire, though neither of them moved. The boundary between them, though invisible, had already started to fray. The nurse's hands felt cold and shaky as she fumbled with the stethoscope, attempting to maintain the professionalism that was rapidly slipping through her fingers. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before moving on to the next part of the examination. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body betraying her calm exterior. "Please remove your shirt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button." He didn't hesitate. There was no awkwardness or self-consciousness as he pulled the fabric over his head and placed it neatly beside him. The nurse swallowed hard, her eyes lingering on his bare torso longer than they should have. His skin was smooth, his chest broad and muscular in a way that felt intimidating. The professionalism she had fought so hard to maintain was hanging by a thread. She reached forward, pressing the stethoscope to his chest, and the moment their skin made contact, she felt it again, an electric charge passing between them, undeniable and overwhelming. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest under her hand, could hear the steady thud of his heart through the stethoscope, but it wasn't the sound she was focusing on. It was the heat of his skin, the closeness of their bodies, the way every breath he took seemed to pull her in closer. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the stethoscope, trying to ignore the way her pulse raced in response to their proximity. She told herself to stay focused, to keep her distance, but the tension between them had already crossed a line. She was no longer thinking like a nurse. She was thinking like a woman who hadn't felt this alive in years. Their eyes met, and in that instant, something shifted. The unspoken connection between them deepened, the attraction no longer a silent undercurrent but a palpable force, pressing against the boundaries of their professional relationship. She should have pulled away, should have stepped back and regained control, but instead, she found herself leaning closer, her hand lingering on his chest as if drawn to him by an invisible force. The patient's gaze never wavered. His calm, composed demeanor remained, but there was something else there now, something that mirrored the intensity building inside her. His breath quickened just slightly, and she could feel his heart beating faster beneath her fingers. They were both aware of the boundary they were crossing, but neither made a move to stop it. The nurse's mind raced, torn between the weight of her professional duty and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. Every rational part of her screamed to stop, to step back and regain her composure, but her body refused to listen. Her hand, still pressed against his chest, lingered far too long, the touch no longer purely clinical. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart under her palm, and the space between them seemed to shrink with every passing second. She could see it in his eyes, he wasn't going to stop her. He was waiting, watching, his expression daring her to take the next step. The tension was unbearable, stretching between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Without thinking, her hand moved, drifting from his chest to his shoulder, her fingers trailing lightly along his skin. The touch was brief, but it was enough to dissolve whatever remained of the professional distance between them. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The patient inhaled sharply, his gaze locking onto hers, and for a moment, the world outside that examination room ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, caught in the heat of the moment, suspended in the space between what was and what could be. The nurse pulled her hand away, but the connection between them remained, humming in the air, thick with anticipation. She had broken the boundary, and though neither of them said a word, they both knew the implications. The examination was over, but something else had just begun. The nurse took a step back, her heart racing, her mind swirling with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. The consequences hung heavy in the air, but in that moment, she didn't care. She had felt something real, something undeniable, and it had awakened a part of her she thought had long since died. The tension between them was palpable now, a thick, invisible force that neither could ignore. The nurse's inner conflict grew with each passing second, the proximity to the patient stirring feelings she had long buried beneath her professional facade. Every fiber of her being told her to step back, to reclaim the distance that had always been her safeguard in these situations. Yet, she found herself leaning in closer, her body betraying the rational part of her mind. She reached for his wrist again, needing to check his pulse one last time, but this time her touch was different. Her fingers lingered, resting on his skin longer than necessary, and she could feel his heartbeat quicken under her touch. The rhythmic thudding of his pulse, once a routine part of her job, now sent waves of electricity coursing through her body. She tried to focus on counting the beats, but her concentration faltered as her awareness of him heightened. The patient's gaze never left her. His eyes, once calm and composed, now held a different kind of intensity, one that mirrored the growing tension between them. His breathing had quickened slightly, though his demeanor remained composed, as if waiting for her next move. There was a challenge in his expression, subtle but undeniable, daring her to acknowledge the shift in their dynamic. Her fingers trembled as they remained on his wrist, the warmth of his skin seeping into hers. She should have let go, should have stepped back and put an end to the growing attraction between them, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. Instead, she let her fingers linger, tracing the outline of his wrist in a way that was far from professional. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with unspoken desire. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize her actions, but every thought was drowned out by the intensity of the moment. This was no longer just an examination, it had transformed into something far more intimate, far more dangerous. The patient, sensing her hesitation, shifted slightly, closing the already small gap between them. His movement was subtle, but the message was clear: he wasn't going to pull away. He was waiting for her to make the next move, and the realization sent her pulse racing. She knew she was playing with fire, knew the consequences of crossing the line between patient and nurse, but the attraction between them was undeniable. It had been there from the moment she entered the room, simmering just beneath the surface, and now it was threatening to boil over. The nurse swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She had never experienced anything like this before, had never allowed herself to get this close to a patient. But something about this man, the way he looked at her, the calm intensity in his gaze, made her forget the rules, forget the consequences. In that moment, all that mattered was the undeniable connection between them. Her hand drifted from his wrist, trailing up his forearm, her touch lingering on his skin. The contact was electric, sending a shiver down her spine, and she could feel the patient's pulse quicken beneath her fingertips. His calm exterior was beginning to crack, his breathing growing shallower as the tension between them escalated. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was charged, filled with everything they weren't saying. The nurse's mind screamed for her to stop, to pull away before it was too late, but her body refused to listen. She was drawn to him, irresistibly, and the more she tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. The patient's gaze darkened, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. His breathing had shifted, matching hers in its rapid pace, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body as the space between them continued to shrink. Without thinking, she moved closer, her hand trailing across his skin, and in that moment, the boundary between them disappeared entirely. The tension that had been building since their first encounter reached its peak, and there was no turning back. She was fully immersed in the moment now, the weight of her responsibilities forgotten in the face of the undeniable attraction between them. Her fingers lingered on his arm, their touch more intimate than before, and she could feel the shared desire humming between them, thick and palpable. The examination had long since transformed into something else, something far more personal, and they both knew it. Neither of them would stop now. The nurse's breath hitched as she gave the patient his next instruction. "Lie back on the exam table," she said, her voice soft but steady. The words were simple, professional, but the tension in the room had shifted the meaning of every interaction between them. The patient complied without hesitation, his movements smooth and deliberate. He reclined on the table, his eyes never leaving hers, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. She stood beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to continue the examination, but she knew they had already crossed the threshold. This wasn't a routine checkup anymore, this was something else entirely. She placed her hand on his chest once again, her fingers brushing against his skin. The touch was electric, the connection undeniable. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to regain control of the situation before it spiraled further out of her grasp, but her body had already made its decision. The space between them had dissolved completely, leaving only the raw tension that had been building since their first encounter. The nurse let her hand linger, the examination now a mere formality as her fingers trailed across his chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her touch. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could hear the quickening of his heartbeat as the air between them grew thick with anticipation. Her pulse raced in time with his, the connection between them stronger than ever. He didn't speak, but his gaze said everything. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only a quiet invitation, an unspoken understanding that they had both crossed the line and there was no going back. His calm demeanor remained, but there was a fire beneath the surface now, a shared desire that neither of them could deny. The nurse's heart pounded in her chest as she moved closer, her body acting on impulse, guided by something far more primal than reason. She was fully aware of the consequences, fully aware that this was wrong, but the attraction between them was overpowering. It was as if they were the only two people in the world, suspended in this moment, the rules and boundaries that had once defined their relationship now crumbling around them. Her hand moved down his arm, trailing across his skin in a way that was no longer professional, no longer appropriate. She could feel him respond beneath her touch, his breath hitching slightly as her fingers lingered on his arm. His gaze never left hers, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The nurse knew she should stop, knew she should step back and regain control, but the pull was too strong. She was drawn to him, irresistibly, and the weight of her responsibilities felt distant, insignificant in the face of the desire that coursed through her. She moved even closer, her body brushing against his as she continued the examination, though it had long since become something more. The patient's eyes darkened, his expression shifting as their proximity grew even more intimate. There was no longer any pretense between them, no longer any barrier to hide behind. They were fully immersed in the moment now, the connection between them palpable, undeniable. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned down, her face inches from his, their lips hovering just out of reach. For a moment, they stayed like that, suspended in the tension, the line between them blurred beyond recognition. The nurse's heart pounded in her chest, the anticipation building until she could no longer resist. And then, in a single, impulsive moment, she closed the gap between them. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, both of them testing the waters, feeling the weight of the moment. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but the intensity that had been building between them quickly erupted into something more. The kiss deepened, their shared desire breaking through the final barrier, and for a moment, they were completely lost in each other. The nurse's hands tangled in his hair, her body pressed against his as the kiss grew more passionate. The tension that had been simmering between them for so long finally found its release, and neither of them held back. They were both fully immersed in the moment, lost in the intensity of their connection. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, the room was filled with a charged silence. They had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The consequences would come later, but for now, all that mattered was the undeniable connection they had found in each other. The moment had been building since the instant they locked eyes, the tension between them simmering beneath the surface, waiting to explode. The nurse stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, her body hovering over the patients as they lay so close on the exam table. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind spinning with the enormity of what was about to happen. She knew she should pull back, regain her composure, but the pull toward him was undeniable. Their faces were just inches apart, their breaths mingling in the space between them, heavy with anticipation. Her gaze flickered down to his lips, then back up to his eyes, and she saw the same desire reflected there, waiting, inviting her to cross the final line that separated them. She could feel the warmth of his skin beneath her hands, his body tense and waiting, every muscle coiled with the same anticipation that raced through her. And then, without another thought, she leaned in, closing the gap that had been teasing them both for too long. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss at first, tasting the waters of what they both knew was an irreversible step. The contact was brief, almost too gentle, but it sent a jolt through her that made her heart skip a beat. The patient didn't pull away, he leaned into the kiss, his hand coming up to cup the side of her face, deepening the connection between them. In that moment, the nurse's world tilted on its axis. All of her carefully constructed walls, all of her professionalism, came crashing down as she gave in to the desire that had been building for what felt like a lifetime. The kiss quickly shifted from tentative to passionate, their need for each other igniting like a spark to dry kindling. She pressed closer, her body leaning into his as their lips moved together in a desperate rhythm, the pent-up tension between them finally breaking free. Her hands roamed over his chest, feeling the heat of his skin, the steady rise and fall of his breath, as though touching him made the moment more real, more tangible. The patient's other hand slipped around her waist, pulling her even closer, and the last shreds of distance between them dissolved completely. There was no more hesitation, no more pretending that this was anything but what it was, two people crossing a boundary they could never return from, fully giving into the attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent as they both let go of any remaining restraint. The nurse's hands tangled in his hair, her body pressed against his as the kiss consumed them both. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palms, racing as fast as her own, their desire now fully out in the open. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for a brief moment, she forgot everything else. The room, the exam table, the fact that she was supposed to be his caregiver, none of it mattered anymore. All that existed was the connection between them, raw and undeniable. His lips parted, and she responded instinctively, her tongue brushing against his in a way that made her pulse race even faster. The kiss was no longer tentative, it was a release, an expression of everything they had been holding back since the moment they met. Her body felt alive in a way it hadn't in years, every nerve ending sparking with sensation as their kiss deepened, as their desire for each other grew more and more palpable with each passing second. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their chests heaving as they tried to catch their breath. The air between them was thick with the weight of what had just happened, the kiss leaving them both reeling from the intensity of it. The nurse's hands remained on his chest, her fingertips brushing against his skin as they stayed close, their foreheads nearly touching as they caught their breath. She could still taste him on her lips, could still feel the heat of his skin beneath her hands, and she knew that what had just happened between them was irreversible. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was charged, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, that this kiss had changed everything. But in that moment, neither of them cared about the consequences. All that mattered was the undeniable connection they had just shared. As the kiss broke, both the nurse and the patient were left breathless, the intensity of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air between them. For a moment, neither moved. Their foreheads nearly touched, the closeness still palpable, but the reality of what they had done began to seep in. The nurse, heart still pounding, took a shaky breath as her mind raced to catch up with the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. Her fingers lingered on his chest, still brushing lightly against his skin, as if trying to hold on to the moment for just a little longer. But with each second that passed, the weight of her actions began to settle on her shoulders, heavier and heavier. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and now, in the stillness of the room, the consequences of that realization hit her all at once. She pulled her hand away from his chest, retreating slightly, though the memory of his warmth stayed with her. Her mind flashed through a dozen different thoughts, what had led her here, how everything had spiraled so quickly out of control. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to remain detached from the personal lives of her patients, to see them simply as individuals in need of care. But this was different. He was different. Her eyes flickered up to his face, and she found him watching her with that same calm intensity that had drawn her in from the very beginning. He wasn't panicked, wasn't rushing to explain or apologize. There was no regret in his gaze, only understanding. He had been as much a part of this as she had, and he wasn't running from it. The nurse, on the other hand, felt a storm brewing inside her. She had never expected something like this, had never allowed herself to even entertain the possibility. But now, with the kiss still fresh on her lips, she couldn't ignore how alive she felt. For the first time in years, she had been shaken out of the numbness that had settled into her life. The routine, the monotony, this man had shattered all of it in one brief, intense moment. But with that exhilaration came fear. What had she done? She couldn't pretend this was just a fleeting, inconsequential moment. They had shared something real, something that had rocked her to her core, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. The patient, for his part, remained composed, still lying back on the exam table, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He looked at her with a quiet understanding, as though he could sense the turmoil within her. He didn't push, didn't try to draw her back in. Instead, he waited, giving her the space to process what had just happened between them. The nurse took a step back, her heart still racing but her mind beginning to slow. She could feel the conflicting emotions battling inside her, guilt, desire, confusion, and, strangely enough, a sense of peace. In this man, she had found something she hadn't realized she was missing, a connection, a spark that had reignited something deep within her. But what now? The boundaries of their relationship had been obliterated, and there was no way to return to the way things were. She knew that their lives would continue, that they would both walk out of this room and return to their separate existences. Yet, the memory of this moment would linger. The kiss had marked her, changed her in a way she couldn't fully comprehend yet. For a long moment, the nurse stood in the quiet of the room, reflecting on the choices she had made, the lines she had crossed. She knew she would have to carry this with her, that the kiss they had shared would not simply fade away. It would stay with her, a reminder of what had happened here today, and the way it had broken through the monotony of her life. With a final glance at the patient, she took a deep breath and straightened, preparing to resume her professional duties. But as she turned to leave the room, she knew she wasn't the same person she had been when she walked in. This experience had awakened something in her, something she wasn't sure she could ever fully ignore again. The connection they had shared would linger, even as they returned to their separate lives, and that realization settled over her like a quiet storm. As the nurse gathered herself, taking slow, deep breaths to calm the storm that still raged within her, she knew she couldn't dwell in the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Her gaze lingered on the patient one last time. He was still lying on the examination table, his eyes steady on hers, silently acknowledging the depth of what had transpired between them. Neither spoke, but there was no need for words now. The connection they had shared was undeniable, and though the moment had passed, the weight of it still hung heavily in the air. She turned away, gathering her equipment, her hands moving automatically through the motions. The routine tasks helped to ground her, reminding her that she still had a job to do, that life would continue despite the whirlwind of emotions she had just experienced. But inside, she felt changed, irrevocably altered by the intimacy they had shared, by the way he had seen through her defenses and ignited something she hadn't felt in years. The patient began to sit up, slowly pulling his shirt back on, but his movements lacked the same ease and calm he had shown earlier. There was something different in the way he moved now, something more deliberate, as if he too was processing the shift between them. When he finally stood, their eyes met once more, and in his gaze, the nurse saw understanding, perhaps even a quiet regret. But neither of them could undo what had happened, and there was a silent acceptance in that realization. She walked toward the door, her hand hovering over the handle for just a moment, allowing herself one last breath before she turned back to him. "I hope everything's in order with your health," she said, her voice soft, trying to find her footing in the aftermath of their encounter. "Everything's fine," he replied, his tone steady but with a hint of something unspoken behind it. His eyes lingered on her, as if trying to convey something more, something that went beyond the words they were exchanging. They stood there, locked in that moment, both fully aware that once she opened the door, everything would go back to the way it had been before. They would return to their separate lives, and this moment would fade into the background, becoming just a memory. Yet, they both knew it was a memory that would linger, a moment that had left its mark on them both in ways they couldn't fully articulate. The nurse finally opened the door, stepping aside to let him pass. The hallway beyond was quiet, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere of the room they had shared. He paused briefly at the threshold, his hand brushing lightly against her arm as he walked past her. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a final shiver down her spine, a last reminder of the tension they had shared. As he walked away, the nurse stood in the doorway, watching him go. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, exhilaration, fear, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite place. She knew this encounter had changed her, that it had awakened a part of her she had long since buried beneath the monotony of her everyday life. And while she didn't know what that meant for her future, she couldn't deny the shift within her. She closed the door softly, leaning against it for a moment as she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had just happened. The sterile, quiet room felt empty now, the air no longer charged with the tension that had filled it moments before. But inside her, the remnants of that intensity still lingered. The nurse straightened, gathering her thoughts and her composure before turning back to her duties. She knew she had to move forward, to return to the routine of her work, but she also knew that the memory of this encounter would stay with her. It had shattered the monotony of her life, leaving her with a sense of being more alive than she had felt in years. As she walked back to the nurse's station, the memory of the patient's gaze, the feel of his touch, and the kiss they had shared echoed in her mind. It was a bittersweet reminder of the line they had crossed and the connection they had found in each other. They would both go on with their lives, but the intensity of that moment, of that kiss, would never truly fade. It would linger, a quiet storm beneath the surface, reminding her that she had felt something real, something undeniable, even if only for a fleeting moment. If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button.